The morning air was heavy as Paul eased his battered Ford pickup onto Interstate 80, just outside Omaha, Nebraska. The sun hadn't yet broken through the haze, and Paul, a guy who'd logged more miles than he could remember, tried to tune out the ache in his shoulders and the growing list of worries on his mind. That day he only wanted to finish the delivery run, a load of machine parts out to a little place near Grand Island, and get back home. Waiting for him, there was his son, Joey, his face a little paler each week, stuck on the couch after another, round with the doctors and their long words. Paul did not want to think about it too much. He just needed to finish up, get paid, and bring home something to make Joey smile. Every mile down those familiar roads, Paul kept telling himself that today would be just like any other. He figured he'd get this job out of the way and maybe squeeze in a couple hours with Joey before the boy got too tired out. But that stretch of highway, which usually blended into the background, suddenly snapped into sharp focus when Paul saw a mess of flashing blue up ahead. There, spread across both lanes, Nebraska State Patrol cruisers blocked the road, their light bars pulsing in the gloom. Paul's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He was used to cops, roadside checks, and that little jab of worry that came when you knew you'd done nothing wrong. But even so, something about the way those cruisers were arranged made his stomach knot. As he slowed, a wave of uneasy faces and quick glances passed between the officers. The way they moved, almost like they were waiting for something or someone, made Paul's heart thump with a cold kind of dread. He rolled down his window, the air outside sharp and oddly quiet beneath the wail of a single distant siren. One of the troopers stepped forward, hand resting near his sidearm, and nodded at Paul's truck. There wasn't a word yet, but Paul knew deep down that whatever this was, it wasn't routine. For one long second, he barely breathed. He felt, in that moment, as if all those years on the road had been leading him right to this point, right here where fate finally caught up. And worse than the fear was not knowing why. Paul had always believed that his truck, which he named Helena after his late wife, was more than just a machine. He had christened her with a little ceremony in their driveway back in Omaha 2 decades ago when he was a younger man, and Helena was still there to laugh at his superstitions. Somehow, attaching her name to that dusty old rig made him think she would watch over him, keep him safe out there on the long, lonely roads that stretched across Nebraska and into Iowa. But as the patrol lights flashed against Helena's weather-beaten sides in that stifling afternoon heat, Paul started to doubt any guardian angel was listening. The sweat ran down his back, plastering his shirt to his skin, while the humming of insects sounded louder than ever in the sudden hush. Helena, with her battered emerald green stripes and faded white paint, stood out on every mile of asphalt. Between Des Moines and Omaha, other drivers recognized her right away. Over the years, her look became a friendly signal that Paul was somewhere nearby, always ready to lend a hand. Now, though, parked by the side of Interstate 80 under the pitiless Midwest sun, Helena looked less like a good luck charm and more like a rolling tomb. The inside of the cab, once full of stories and laughter with Helena riding shotgun, felt empty and stale. Paul stared at the dash, half remembering how Helena used to leave notes for him tucked by the radio, quick scribbles, wishing him a safe haul and a hot meal at the day's end. Those memories seemed far away now, almost like they belonged to someone else. While the officers moved around his trailer, their radios crackling, Paul sat with Helena's steering wheel cold under his trembling hands and wondered where things started to go wrong. All that history, every dent and scratch on Helena, a piece of his life, now felt like they had led him to this stretch of road with nowhere left to turn. From the corner of his eye, Paul could see his reflection in the window, his face drawn, every line a marker of hard years. But there was still a stubborn bit of hope there, somewhere under the worry. He tried to remind himself that trucks, like Helena and the men who drove them never quit easily. But that evening, with the horizon burning orange and the cops pacing outside, even Paul had to admit he was afraid. Paul's troubles hadn't just started with flashing lights that afternoon. The real fork in the road came a couple of weeks earlier, when he met Tony at a rundown diner off Route 6, outside Council Bluffs. Tony was all smiles and smooth talk, promising a delivery job that seemed almost too good to be true. He said it was a rush order of auto parts destined for a repair shop in Des Moines. There was cash up front, more coming on delivery, and no strings besides a strict deadline. Paul, desperate for a lucky break after months of medical bills piling up from Joey's latest stay in the hospital, told himself not to look a gift horse. In the mouth, still, Tony's voice had been a little too slick, a little too eager, like someone selling snake oil from the back of a van. Paul signed off on the job, only half listening as Tony rattled through the paperwork. The manifest said engine parts and brake units, all sealed up tight in boxes, stamped with some company logo Paul didn't recognize. When he loaded them into Helena, though, something sat wrong. The weight was off. Not enough for the size of the crates, but more than any regular order he'd ever hauled. And then there was that strange, sharp smell, nothing like motor oil or rubber. It hit him as soon as he swung open the cargo door like a warning. His gut twisted, but at that point, Paul's list of options was short. The amount of money Tony promised was just enough to cover the outstanding insurance bill for Joey's surgery. Every time Paul tried to tell himself to walk away, he pictured his son asleep in the hospital, tubes taped to his arm. That broke down his last bit of caution, quicker than he cared to admit. He went ahead and signed, deciding he'd do what so many in his business did, trust the manifest and keep his questions to himself. He tried not to wonder anymore about that phone call from Tony, about why the job landed so easily in his lap, when every other company in town had started cutting costs by the week. In trucking, he'd learned quickly that asking questions was sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do. Eyes on the road, head down, hold on tight. That had always gotten him through before. He hoped, as he watched the troopers through Helena's dusty windshield, it would be enough this time too. Sitting in the cab with the engine idling low, Paul noticed the static heavy silence from his CB radio. Normally, by this hour, he would be catching jokes and weather reports from other truckers cruising along Interstate 80. The familiar voices, Chuck from Sioux City, Melinda from Davenport, had a way of making the long drive a little less lonely. But now, not even a friendly breaker 19 crackled across the frequency. That silence crawled in and took up space, making everything feel 10 times heavier. It was like the whole network of drivers just vanished, leaving him stranded, in more ways than one. The Nebraska State Patrol was everywhere, their cars blocking the highway, with a purpose that made it clear this wasn't some random checkpoint. Paul did a quick scan of his mirrors and counted at least half a dozen officers around Helena, each one with the same hard look on their face. They didn't talk to him much as they motioned for him to step out. The way they carried themselves, hands hovering close to tasers and sidearms, told him this was more than a routine stop. They already saw him as guilty. It didn't matter that his papers were in order or that his delivery slips matched the manifest. The air felt thick with judgment, and Paul realized his word wouldn't count for much. The moment his boots hit the warm pavement, he could sense the unspoken decision hanging over the scene. Paul was not Paul Bennett, father of a sick boy and dependable hauler, not anymore. He was just another suspect, boxed in and presumed to be on the wrong side of the law. One officer, a younger guy, his name tag reading Harris, started reciting questions, each one sharper than the last, all while avoiding Paul's eyes. As they prepared to open Helena's trailer, Paul's heart pounded so hard he thought it might give him away. All those years he'd spent dodging trouble and doing right by folks came crashing into the present. Paul understood it only took a few seconds for a life to slip from normal to unrecognizable, for a dad with problems to become a problem himself in the eyes of those who had the power to decide. That day, on the edge of a shimmering highway, he realized just how fast everything could shift and just how alone one man could feel, even with a whole crew of officers close enough to touch. Paul watched as Officer Harris and his team worked through Helena's trailer with a kind of careful purpose that made his stomach drop. One cop sliced the security seal, and the loud snap of metal seemed to echo way too long in the muggy air. Paul stood off to the side, powerless, as cardboard boxes were dragged out and lined up like they were evidence in some TV crime show. They tore one box open, then another, and then another. Each time, instead of engine parts or brake calipers, out came bundles of plastic-wrapped packets hidden beneath layers of fake shipping documents. The officers traded glances, their expressions shifting from suspicion to grim certainty. The word they tossed around, just loud enough for Paul to hear, was narcotics. The boxes held something far more dangerous and illegal than he'd ever suspected. Pills and powder sorted into long, neat rows. Paul's hands started to shake, and a cold sweat pricked his forehead as he realized just how badly he had been set up. He never thought Tony would rope him into something like this, and there was nothing he could say or do now to explain himself to these officers. His mind was already racing ahead to Joey, picturing his son waiting by the window at home, wondering when Dad would be back. When Officer Russell, the one who'd barely spoken a word until now, came over and snapped the handcuffs around Paul's wrists, the wave of guilt nearly knocked him down. But it wasn't the fear of being caught or the shame of the crime. The worst part was the betrayal. Paul had always tried to do right, and now, with cold metal biting into his skin, he was forced to see just how blind he'd been. He trusted Tony because he needed things to work out, and that trust had cost him more than he could afford. As the officers read him his rights and led him to the back of the patrol car, Paul's thoughts jumbled together. He thought of Helena, abandoned and empty by the roadside, her years of steady work wiped away in a single afternoon. He thought of Joey's surgery bill, sitting on the kitchen table next to thawing meatloaf. All he felt was the sting of being used and left, holding the bag as if everyone else had known except him. The sense of being sold out by someone he once called a friend cut deeper than any threat of jail could. In the back of the Nebraska State Patrol cruiser, Paul stared out the window, trying to make sense of what had just crashed down on his life. The scenery zipped past. Cornfields and distant barns under an evening sky. Nothing looked different out there, but inside he was stuck in a storm of questions. He pressed his head back against the seat and tried to puzzle it all out. How did it happen? Who set him up, and for what reason? Every new thought seemed to come up against a wall, and all the facts he knew about himself meant nothing to the people in charge. By the time they reached the downtown Omaha precinct, Paul felt hollowed out. They marched him through double doors and into a holding room with walls that made the place feel smaller than it really was. Two detectives took turns asking him the same questions from different angles. How long did you know Tony? Did you check the load? Who else was involved? Paul had nothing aside from the simple truth. He needed the money and signed up for what he believed was a regular job. His answers sounded weaker each time, especially with the way the older detective looked at him, like he was just another story they'd heard 100 times before. All through the process, Paul's history didn't help him. 3 decades hauling Midwest cargo, never once in trouble, a stack of community awards on the kitchen shelf, but none of it seemed to count now. He realized fast that the officers had already marked him guilty. The evidence looked too clean, the setup almost professional, and there was nobody in that cold room who cared about the man he had been before today. No one wanted to listen when you were wearing cuffs and your truck was found loaded with drugs. The longer the questions went on, the more hopeless it all felt. Paul kept thinking about Joey. How was the kid supposed to get by now with his dad behind bars and no more insurance money coming in? He tried to hold on to the small bit of hope that maybe the truth would come out. But the way the detectives kept circling back, hammering the same doubts, made it clear. In this system, his word was worth less than nothing. That, more than the charges he faced, was what made him feel truly lost. Just when Paul felt like there was nowhere left to turn, his sister called with trembling excitement in her voice. She said that his nephew, Lucas, had discovered something. When he was looking through his old phone footage, it had happened at the loading warehouse just outside Council Bluffs. Lucas, who was obsessed with filming everything from skateboard tricks to sunsets, had been recording the day Paul left with the cargo, capturing small moments without much reason, until now. In the background of a minute-long video, timed to the truck's scheduled departure, you could clearly see Paul standing by the vending machines, chatting with a security guard. Meanwhile, a couple of warehouse workers, faces half hidden under baseball caps, moved quickly in and out of Helena's open trailer, shuffling boxes just moments before the doors were sealed and the stamp slapped on. Lucas brought the video straight to Paul's public defender, who sat stunned through the clip twice before calling the prosecutor's office. It was not slam-dunk evidence, but it at least showed Paul was nowhere near the trailer during crucial minutes when the illegal cargo could have been added or swapped. That night, locked in a holding cell with just enough static to catch a baseball game on the radio, Paul heard a faint buzz of hope for the first time in days. Maybe, just maybe, this grainy footage would be enough to change the way people saw him. He understood there were no guarantees. The courts had a way of dragging things out, and sometimes being lucky did not mean getting justice. Even with that video, it would only take one detail missed, one hard-nosed agent or lawyer determined to win, and his whole world could go back to being upside down. But Paul realized he finally had something real to stand on, a shred of proof that his story was more than just words. He owed Lucas more than he could ever express. As he waited for the next morning's interview, Paul replayed Lucas's shaky footage a dozen times in his mind, looking for hope in every blurry frame. It was not much, but it was a start. In that little corner of the cell, the idea that someone believed him, and had proof too, meant it was not quite over yet. The mood inside the Omaha precinct shifted as word about the video spread. Still, the detectives from the Nebraska State Patrol were not ready to let Paul off the hook. They sat him down in another small room, bright lights buzzing overhead, and started pushing for answers even harder. "Why didn't you check your own trailer?" one asked. Another, arms crossed, wanted to know why Paul would accept a last-minute job with almost no paperwork, no references, and no one there to vouch for him except Tony, who had already disappeared into thin air. The questions rolled in one after another, like cracks forming in a wall he had spent years building around himself. Why did you think this job was worth the risk? Didn't you wonder why the pay was so good for what sounded like a simple run? Paul sat there, hands folded, tight in his lap, and thought about every choice that had led him here. He remembered the first time Tony approached him at the truck stop outside Kearney, back when Joey's pile of hospital bills had reached a breaking point. Tony had seemed harmless at first, a little pushy, maybe, but nothing out of the ordinary. For a guy in a hurry, the offer had been clear and simple: take one load to Des Moines, no questions asked, double the usual rate. Paul's gut told him to ask more, but his head was crowded with desperate thoughts of Joey, the bills, the possibility that this one job might solve everything. It all made sense at the time. That is what hurt most about sitting in that interrogation room, how easy it had been to talk himself into it. The officers, though, only saw recklessness. To them, trusting Tony with no second thought looked like the act of a man hiding something, not a father who was out of options. And now, having traded caution for a promise, he was the one who got burned. Paul tried to explain just how difficult it was to turn down what looked like a lifeline when you were drowning, but the officers' faces stayed hard, skeptical. All they wanted were facts. They were not interested in the fear or the worry that pushed him to sign those forms without reading every word. Every lousy moment replayed in his mind as he stared at the desk, feeling the weight of regret settle in his bones. In the end, it was not just a job lost. That decision had cost him his freedom, at least for now. Even with Lucas's video now filed in as real evidence, the prosecutors were not about to let Paul walk out free. The lead official from the Nebraska State Patrol, Commander Anderson, sat across from him with a calm that somehow made Paul even more nervous. The commander didn't sugarcoat things. He pointed at the piles of forms and files scattered across the metal table. "We all know someone else is pulling the strings. You're just a pawn, Paul. We need to climb up the ladder, and that means you need to help us bring in the person who actually set this up." The message was simple. They wanted Tony, or whoever was behind the operation, and until someone higher up was named, Paul was going to be stuck as the face of the case. At that moment, Paul felt all the old fears he'd kept buried come back, up one by one. There was the non-stop memory of Joey's cough echoing in their tiny apartment, the envelopes marked urgent piling up on the kitchen counter, and now the risk that his mistakes could cost his son any chance at a better future. All that weight pressed down on him in the stale air of the interrogation room. Admitting what he knew about Tony, not everything but enough, might turn the focus away from him. But just thinking about it made his chest tight. He'd always lived by the rule that you didn't rat on people, even those who turned on you. It was a code passed down for generations. Yet things were different now. He was not a reckless kid or an eager young man trying to prove something in the Union Hall. This was about Joey's well-being. If keeping silent meant losing any chance of seeing Joey grow up, was the old code even worth holding on to? Paul could see, for the first time, the real danger of being noble for the sake of pride. He was stuck at a crossroads that felt enormous. Either he stayed quiet, hoping some miracle would clear his name, or he took a huge gamble and told them what he knew about Tony's meetings and shady contacts at the truck stop. There was no easy answer. For the first time, Paul realized his next choice carried the full weight of his life, not just his, but Joey's too, and he knew he might only get one shot to make things right. The hours crawled by after that tense meeting with Commander Anderson. Paul spent a long, sleepless night staring at the cracked ceiling of his holding cell, listening to the shifts change out in the corridor and trying not to get caught up in the noises that echoed through the old building. Every time he closed, his eyes, images and voices tumbled through his mind. Joey shivering under a blanket, the hum of machines in the hospital room, and the memory of Tony's easy grin at the truck stop. It was nearly sunrise when the guards came for him, telling him the officials wanted to talk again. They led him into the interview room, where a couple of lawyers in crisp suits were already waiting with Anderson at the end of the table. The senior prosecutor spoke calmly, outlining the deal once more. If Paul helped fill in the gaps and testified about the people behind the scenes, names, times, places, the state would consider a more lenient sentence, maybe even drop the charges if it turned out he truly was just a victim. Paul listened, jaw tight, silent as they explained what was at stake. At first, something in him hated the idea. He thought about all the years of keeping quiet, working hard, and never stepping on anyone's toes. Growing up, people called it pride. Now it just felt like something heavy he lugged around, especially when it meant putting Joey's future at risk. For a while, Paul just sat there, torn between his father's old warnings not to betray anyone, And the memory of Joey's little hand wrapped around his finger on surgery day. That's what finally pushed him. He realized this was not about old loyalties or rules outgrown. It was about giving his kid a fair chance. Paul took a shaky breath and explained what he saw in the warehouse that morning, how Tony made calls. In the shadows, how there were two men unloading unmarked crates long before the rest of the crew came in, and how Tony always seemed to know when the security cameras were turned the wrong way. It was not a grand speech, just the plain truth he should have said sooner. When the meeting ended, Paul felt drained, but lighter. He knew none of this would magically fix everything, and he was still scared of what might come next. But now, at least, there was a kind of hope tied not just to luck, but to the choices he decided to finally make. After speaking his truth, Paul took a deep breath and waited while the investigators shuffled out of the room to talk things over. The old walls felt colder and time dragged, but when they came back, Anderson carried paperwork and a careful look. Paul's lawyer explained the details. If Paul kept cooperating and played his part, the state would shift the story in his favor. The official version would be that Paul got swept up in a mix-up at the warehouse, that any blame was misplaced, and that the real focus was now on Tony and others involved in the operation. Paul would return to the world outside as if nothing had happened. At least that was the plan. It was not the kind of freedom Paul dreamed about, but it was enough. He'd get out, keep his head down, and try to hold what was left of his routine together for Joey. But it came with conditions. He would need to behave like everything was normal, driving his usual routes, keeping an eye out for anything unusual, while also feeding back information through Anderson's team. Paul had never considered himself a sneaky guy, but now he was expected to live like nothing had changed on the outside, all the while knowing he was one wrong move away from blowing his cover. His heartbeat thudded louder with each new day back on the job. Omaha looked the same, but his nerves were shot. He spotted Tony lurking near the old diner one afternoon, saw parked cars he swore he'd never noticed before, caught himself glancing over his shoulder at every stop. Each casual chat felt loaded. At home, Paul was even more careful, checking doors twice before sitting down with Joey for dinner, making small talk about baseball and chores, hiding the truth behind tired eyes and forced smiles. The hardest part was knowing the risks. Tony was not the kind of man to just let betrayal slide. Paul knew word got around fast in their business. If Tony even suspected Paul had talked, it would mean trouble, the type that ended careers, or worse, lives. Still, the thought of going silent again, handing Tony and all those like him a blank check to keep going, seemed even more dangerous. Paul clung to the deal not out of hope, but out of quiet duty, to Joey and to himself, knowing that some choices once made could never be taken back. The days leading up to seeing Tony again felt almost unreal. Paul managed to keep his routine going just enough to avoid raising any red flags, but he was wound up tight inside, always waiting for a sign that Tony had caught on to him. When the call finally came, it was short and direct. Meet, as usual. By the lot behind the Nebraska Furniture Mart, Paul spent the morning rehearsing what he'd say, how he'd act, and hoped it would be enough to keep Tony off his trail. When Tony arrived, he was different from before. Cooler, eyes darting, around like he was reading trouble in every shadow. There was no small talk or easy laughter. Instead, Tony stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and waited for Paul to make the first move. Paul forced a grin, trying to play up the same old trust between them. He could tell Tony was watching, him for cracks, waiting to see if anything felt off. There was a certain chill to Tony's voice, but then, with a slow nod, he offered Paul another job. This time, the stakes were even higher. Tony laid out the plan. Haul a new shipment, a big one up to Minneapolis. The pay would be double what Paul earned on the last run, enough to cover months of bills, maybe even get Joey into that therapy program he'd been asking about. But behind that offer was something darker. Tony did not need to spell out what would happen if Paul messed up or grew a conscience. Paul listened, nodded along, and pretended to be in on it. He swallowed his fear and matched Tony's look with a steady gaze and a thin, fake smile. Inside, Paul's nerves were jangling. It was one thing to talk about deals in a windowless room, but standing in front of Tony made the danger real. Still, he agreed to the job with a short handshake, holding on just a second longer than needed, trying to mirror confidence. The ruse had to be perfect. He could not tip his hand with a stutter or a misplaced glance. Afterward, he walked back to his truck, heart racing, telling himself over and over that he just had to keep this act up a little longer, for Joey and for himself, until the right moment came. Back at home that night, Paul could hardly sleep. He lay awake, thinking through every move, every word Tony had said, and reminding himself to keep his story straight. The next day, bright and early, he found himself back at the precinct, this time with a different kind of preparation. The tech guys from the State Patrol sat him down, fitting a tiny earpiece snug behind his ear and slipping a small microphone into the lining of his jacket. Paul never imagined he would become the guy wearing a wire, but there he was, nodding, along as they ran him through the signals he should use if things went wrong. The whole process was nerve-wracking. He felt like he was on display even before stepping out the door. When he got to the loading site, the air was sharp and the mood far from friendly. The old warehouse on the edge of town was always drafty, but this time there was something in the silence that put Paul even more on edge. The men there kept their conversations short, eyes flicking toward him and then away. Tony was somewhere in the background, but he had other people running this end of the job. No one greeted Paul by name or treated him like an old colleague. He was just another trucker to them, another part of the machinery they managed from. The shadows. Paul focused on his breathing, trying not to let his nerves show. He went through all the checks he was supposed to do, tire pressure, trailer locks, paperwork, his hands moving faster than usual as the adrenaline kicked in. Even so, every few minutes, he would catch himself glancing at the truck or listening for the crackle of the wire, half convinced that everyone around could tell he was carrying a secret. Then, when he slid open the rear door of the trailer to make his inspection, something stopped him cold. Taped right next to one of the metal crossbars on the inside wall was a worn photo of him and Joey at the zoo, faces beaming, sunburned and leaning on each other. He stared at it, the sudden lump in his throat nearly choking him. That picture had vanished from his wallet nearly 3 months earlier, and he had searched everywhere with no luck. Now, seeing it here, tucked away in this dangerous space, Paul understood. These people did not just know about his life, they were sending a message. He was deep in the game now, maybe deeper than he ever realized. Paul's hands shook as he ran his finger over the edges of the photo, trying to steady himself before someone noticed his reaction. The message behind it settled like a weight in his stomach. Whoever was running things from the shadows wanted him to know just how close they were, how easily they could reach into parts of his life he thought were private. In that moment, it stopped being about trucks, money, or even the law. This was a warning, done without any shouting or threats, a piece of his own life handed back in a way that twisted his insides with fear. He tried to act normal as he finished up his inspection, careful not to let his eyes dart around suspiciously. Every person near the loading bay suddenly seemed more menacing, their short words and quick glances sharper than before. It was as if everyone there already knew what hung over his head. Every step he took, every call he made, every lie he spoke. To Joey, about work, they might be watching or listening, probably both. The idea that a simple mistake on his part could cost him, or far worse, hurt his son, made his chest ache. As Paul started the engine and listened to the rumble, he realized that nothing about this job was what it seemed anymore. The official, Deal with the Nebraska State Patrol was supposed to give him protection, a sense that he was doing what needed to be done for the right reasons. Now he could hardly believe in that. He pictured Joey's face before school, the way he'd hug his dad and look up with absolute trust. Paul felt more exposed than ever, like the entire world knew his secrets and could use them to press him into any corner they pleased. He drove out of the lot on shaky legs, haunted by the photo and what it meant. Every mile north toward Minneapolis, the road stretched ahead like a silent test. Could he really trust anyone, or was he just a pawn, destined to be squeezed until he had nothing left to give? The danger wasn't just from the police or even Tony. It was built into the whole system, closing in around him, making it clear that his family would always be the leverage, no matter which side he thought he was on. The first hour on the highway was the hardest. Paul kept staring at the empty roads stretching out past Lincoln and into the wide open spaces, his mind going 1,000 directions at once. The truck rumbled along north, and each mile only made the knot in his gut tighter. He kept thinking this was never about making it out himself. What truly mattered, and what terrified him most, was Joey. The folks running this show had shown how quickly they could get close, and Paul's own picture taped in the most unthinkable place was proof. If the wrong people thought he was playing both sides, they would come for him, but they might come for Joey, too. The deal with the Nebraska State Patrol sounded simple enough in that windowless back room. Just drive the load, keep talking, turn off at the prearranged mile marker west of Sioux City, and someone in a state car would meet him, hidden in plain sight among the traffic at a diner. But out on the road, every small hitch in the trip set off fresh waves of nerves. He worried about the truck behind him, keeping too tight a distance. He wondered if that silver sedan in the left lane was just a regular commuter or something worse. Paul checked his mirrors so often his neck ached, and he kept replaying the scene with the photograph in his mind, searching for any missed detail that could have tipped him off sooner. Hours passed, the sun dropping lower as he closed in on Sioux City. The time to turn off was coming up, mile marker 126, plain as day on the paperwork. Paul's hand hovered over the blinker. This was the route the police wanted him to take, the safe way, except it sure did not feel safe anymore. All he could picture was people in dark jackets waiting for him, or the wrong eyes, watching from the wrong car. For a half mile, he just kept going straight, paralyzed by the same panic that woke him up sweating at night. Could he really trust Anderson's people to have his back? Or was he safer putting his faith in luck alone? He ran through every possible outcome, Joey's face, the danger still hanging over their heads, and realized he was out of options. He had to choose, stick to the plan or disappear into the night and hope no one followed. Paul gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white as he made his decision. At the last minute, with his blinker off and his pulse pounding, he eased the truck off the main highway and onto a side road, wheels crunching over gravel instead of humming on asphalt. With each turn down those backcountry roads, telephone wires zipped by overhead and endless cornfields closed in on him. Paul picked up the burner phone from the passenger seat, his hands slick with sweat, and quickly dialed Anderson's direct line. He kept his voice even as he passed along the message. The plan had changed. He was taking the alternate route. No going back now. The response on the other end was brief. Anderson said they heard him and would shift officers right away. Still, Paul knew this was no guarantee. By now, Tony's people were probably scrambling, all their alarms blaring, and every radio was set to scan the highways and rural backroads. Paul's mind kept circling back to Joey. Was his nephew Ryan with him? And had the cops kept their promise to keep the boy safe and hidden? The fear tightened his chest with every mile he drove. He imagined the worst: strangers at the door, a car out front not belonging to anyone he knew, red and blue lights cutting through the night while Joey watched from the window. Around each bend, Paul expected someone to come out fast behind him or try to block the way ahead. He kept glancing at the mirrors, half expecting to spot Tony's truck or a dark sedan hugging the road. The feeling of being hunted seeped into his bones, and now every old barn and mailbox looked like a hiding spot for danger. He was no longer just an informant or a truck driver. He was running, hoping he'd made the right call, hoping trust in the state patrol would not cost everything. Back at home, Paul had to believe Ryan followed the plan and got Joey out when the signal was given. That thought kept him going as the truck bounced down another rough turn. All that mattered now was finishing the drive and coming out alive on the other side. The full scope of this mess came crashing down. What started as a job had saved him once, then pulled him in deep, and now left him tearing along side roads, desperate to stay a step ahead for both himself and the son, waiting for him at home. Paul never expected the final showdown to feel so surreal. After hours of bouncing along forgotten roads, squinting at every set of headlights and praying no one dangerous was tailing him, he finally reached the spot Anderson had described over the phone. Floodlights suddenly cut through the darkness, washing over the truck and making everything else outside look small and far away. Tires screeched as unmarked cars formed a half circle around him. Armed agents in bulletproof vests fanned out, motioning for Paul to keep his hands high and still. He obeyed the commands, numb with exhaustion and unable to tell if he was more relieved or afraid. Within minutes, the back doors of the truck were flung open and the contents spilled into the night, a sight that made Paul's stomach drop. There were crates sealed with thick tape, duffels stuffed with powders and pills, and rows of military rifles that looked out of place in any civilian's hands. Tucked away inside sturdy metal boxes, agents also found surveillance gear and documents, stamped with foreign insignias. But what grabbed everyone's full attention was a thick folder, heavier than it looked, packed with lists and photographs. An officer waved Paul over, her face shadowed in the floodlight. In that folder, among a mess of coded nicknames and government seals, Paul recognized Joey's full name and birth date printed in neat ink, circled in red like it was just another item on a to-do list. For a second, Paul felt the whole world tilt. It wasn't only about him being pushed around anymore. It never was. Not really. Seeing Joey's name among dealers and suspected threats froze Paul in place. These people were not playing by any normal rules. They had crossed a line and turned the threat into something colder, using children's names as leverage, dragging families into a game where losing meant more than just prison. Paul's anger replaced the fear for a brief moment. He pointed at the list, demanding to know how Anderson's team had missed this detail or let things get this close. The agents kept working, talking into radios and bagging evidence, but the weight of the discovery was heavy on everyone there. What started as a desperate deal, a risky gamble to protect his kid, had exposed something much bigger, and now they all saw just how deep the damage ran. Paul stood there on the busted-up roadside, the flashing lights making everything look both unreal and harsh. Anderson, the commander from the Nebraska State Patrol, finally pulled him aside, face drawn and voice softer than Paul had ever heard. He told Paul that Joey was safe. The boy had been moved earlier that day to a secure house outside Des Moines, guarded round the clock. Nobody outside the tight-knit team even knew where the place was. When Paul heard this, every muscle in his body seemed to give out at once. The fear and tension he had carried for days hit him all at once, bigger and heavier now that he knew. They had made it out the other side. He sat down right there in the dust, knees weak, head in his hands. A storm of relief took over, one he had not let himself imagine feeling. It was like carrying a full load up a mountain, and then, out of nowhere, being allowed to drop the weight and finally breathe. Paul let himself sob, tears coming hard and fast, mixing together fear, pain, and more gratitude than he could say. He didn't care who saw him. For weeks he had been holding it all together for everyone else, for Joey, for Ryan, for the officers who needed him steady. At that moment, none of it could stay locked up anymore. When he could finally catch his breath, Paul noticed Anderson hovering nearby, giving him the space he needed but ready if Paul wanted to talk. That small mercy stuck with Paul. He managed to nod a thank you, simple, but carrying so much inside it. Anderson told him to rest easy, reassured him again about Joey's safety, and reminded him there would be time to figure out everything else in the days ahead. For the first time in what felt like forever, the world outside danger was close enough for Paul to picture. Sitting in the dirt, the night air finally felt like it belonged to him. The scars of the last few months would not disappear, he knew. But he would live with them. He had fought through everything, the betrayals, the weight of secrets, the threat to his family, and somehow he and Joey had come through. That sense of survival, battered but still whole, gave him the hope to think about what came next. Paul watched from behind the tinted windows of the patrol car as the final piece of all this chaos fell into place. The evidence found in the truck and the testimonies collected along the way made it impossible for Tony, once his boss, sometimes a friend, mostly a shadow, to slip away. With the Nebraska State Patrol and federal agents working together, Tony was tracked down not far from Council Bluffs. Paul was there when they brought him in. The moment was quiet, nothing like the dramatic scenes on television. There was no yelling, no bravado. Just a shuffle of feet in the dust and two men, one resigned, the other hollowed by everything that had happened between them. Tony barely met Paul's eyes as the officer guided him out of the squad car. Their stare lasted only a handful of seconds, but everything Paul needed to say seemed to pass between them without words. Regret lined Tony's face, a look Paul could not remember seeing before. When the handcuffs clicked shut, Tony managed. Just a few hushed words. He looked at Paul and said he was sorry. Not for getting caught, but for dragging Paul and Joey into a world neither of them ever asked for. Paul nodded, unsure how he felt. Anger, sadness, a strange sense of relief all ran together. He could tell that in the end, Tony's real punishment was not court or prison time. It was having to face the choices he had made, the people he had hurt, and the life he could never put right again. Paul saw that emptiness in him, and for a second almost pitied the man who had once been close enough to trust. After Tony was taken away, life did not snap back to normal. Paul was left facing a different kind of trial, finding a way to live without letting this mess chew him up inside. He knew he could not erase what happened, but he did not have to let the anger or regret follow him forever. Walking back to where Ryan was waiting, Paul set his jaw and promised himself that if anything good came out of this, it would be his choice to move forward for both him and Joey without carrying Tony's burdens any longer. The worst chapter was over, and the rest of the story was finally up to him. Time moved slowly after everything. Paul found himself stepping carefully through every day, always half expecting old habits or dangers to come sneaking back. He made a decision early on. No more shortcuts, no more fast money. He said no to a couple of tempting jobs from guys who wanted the old Paul behind the wheel for risky hauls stretching between Omaha and Denver or farther west to the coast. He even stopped running routes on the big highways altogether. Instead, Paul picked up shifts hauling feed, lumber, or equipment for local farmers around Polk County, sticking to the small state roads and seeing the same faces at the diner every week. Each job was smaller, but it brought a different kind of reward. Paul started noticing details on the back roads he never saw when he was hustling extra cash. Weathered barns with peeling paint, a dog barking from a porch, the bright green of cornfields when the sun hit just right. He found a strange comfort in the quiet, in knowing what he was carrying and exactly who was waiting for him when he got home. His runs ended before dinner time, bringing him back to Joey and Ryan most nights, where the three of them would eat pizza on the couch, talk about homework, or watch old movies. The wounds from the past were slow to heal. There were nights when Paul would wake up sweating, sometimes replaying the flickering images of the stakeout or the way Tony had looked with those empty eyes. Some of those scars ran deep, but at the same time, something good began to fill in the gaps. Paul felt a kind of pride he had not known before. He could open the back of his truck and feel nothing but relief, just plain cargo, no secrets or lies tucked away, clearing each delivery, even just sacks of grain or dusty boxes of farm tools, lightened his heart. He noticed, too, how every moment with Joey felt different. Dropping him off at school, staying until baseball practice ended, or just sitting in the yard watching fireflies, Paul caught himself treasuring these bits of ordinary life. Losing the burden of old secrets gave him a new sense of freedom and belonging. Out on those quiet Nebraska roads, away from everything that almost broke him, Paul figured out what it truly meant to belong, not just to a place but to the people waiting at home.